Okay, hello and welcome to the Department of Sociology seminar series here at City, University of London. My name is Diana Yeh and I'm a senior lecturer in Sociology, Culture and the Creative Industries here at City. It's wonderful to be here again among many old friends as well as many new here because of a collective concern and interest in Sarah's talk on the growing crisis we're experiencing in the Neoliberal Academy. So particularly close to home for me are the severe staffing cuts at UEL, where I used to teach. But clearly this is a topic that is resonating widely as we have a huge audience today from across the UK, but also further afield in Ireland, Germany, the Netherlands, Turkey, South Africa, and Australia, to name but a few places. So a warm welcome to everybody. Today's talk is a part of an ongoing public seminar series, and I think many of you who've signed up for Sarah's talk today will probably also be very interested in our final event of the year. This will feature Jo Littler from City Sociology, speaking as part of the CARE Collective in an event organised in conjunction with University of East Anglia, who will be hosting the event. And hopefully we can give you a link to that in the chat. So if you're interested in finding out more about our events, please follow us at City Sociology, as well as our sister network, City NRJ, which stands for Network for Racial Justice, and GSRC, which is City's Gender and Sexualities Research Centre. Okay, so today I'm hugely excited to be introducing Sarah Burton to you all. Sarah is the Leverhulme Early Career Fellow in the Department of Sociology at City. Her research areas include representations of the intellectual, practices of knowledge production, and questions of expertise, especially in terms of concepts such as cosmopolitanism, nationalism, and multilingualism. And Sarah completed her PhD, Crafting the Academy, Writing Sociology in Disciplinary Legitimacy at Goldsmiths in London. So today, Sarah will be talking about the space for kindness in the Neoliberal Academy. In terms of format, she'll be talking for about 30 to 40 minutes, and then the rest of the hour will be devoted to questions and discussion. We're using the Q&A function, so please feel free to start posting any questions as and when they arise to you, so we can kind of have a log, although I will also invite speakers to ask their questions verbally in person to kind of create a stronger sense of community. So Sarah, a very warm welcome. We're all hugely excited to have you here today and really looking forward to hearing what you have to say on this incredibly important topic.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm just going to share my screen. Make sure that everyone can see everything first. There we are, brilliant. Okay, so today I'm going to be talking about CARE and the Neoliberal University and how we might understand the power relations underneath academic kindness. So if you take a cursory look around social media, fashion, home interiors, daily discourse, you'll notice a proliferation of kindness talk. It's on t-shirts, artwork, slogans, hashtags, headlines. It's also emerged really strongly within the context of academia or academic kindness, and this is what I'm going to discuss today. We're often encouraged, even commanded to be kind to one another or to show or practice academic kindness, usually as a way of making stressful and challenging spaces that bit easier to be in. I was quite an early adopter of this idea of academic kindness, but the more time I spend in academia and the more I think about the power relations hiding underneath these calls for a greater academic kindness, the more I feel quite skeptical about the specific framings we have of academic kindness. And it's those power relations that I want to outline today, and why thinking in terms of these hierarchies and inequalities has made me rethink the usefulness of academic kindness as a concept. And I want to set out also maybe what we might need instead, what might a real pushback to the academic, to the neoliberal university look like. So I'm going to begin with a short summary of the problem or the neoliberal university. And I'm going to discuss this in the context of my fieldwork with academics to try and give a sense of what the neoliberal university is like on the ground, what it feels like in the everyday. I'm then going to move on to unpick some of the power relations going on with respect to positions of care, generosity, feeling, emotionality, and affect in the neoliberal university, and essentially talk about what is meant under the term academic kindness and why I think it isn't necessarily all that helpful. And finally, I'm going to outline what I see as a more fruitful and indeed challenging way to do kindness as part of the neoliberal university. So, the unhappy academy. It is a truth universally acknowledged that if you put two or more academics in a room together, they will ultimately end up sharing horror stories. This will happen even faster if the academics are early career, casualized, or in any sense precarious, underemployed, women, people of color, migrants, trans people, disabled people. So why is it that academia and academics are apparently so unkind? Why do we all have horror stories? The usual culprit is the neoliberal university, which, as Vic Loveday says, is characterized by processes of expansion, marketization, measurement, which have transformed the landscape of the UK's higher education. Neoliberalism creates atmospheres of extremes. Michael Billick says it's characterized by a culture of boasting, and Ros Gill has identified the ways in which it invokes feelings of exhaustion, stress, overload, insomnia, anxiety, shame, hurt, aggression, guilt, out of placeness, fraudulence, and fear of exposure within the contemporary academy. But what does this look like on the ground? Participants in my ethnography, and I should say it was originally an ethnography of how academics write, how academics produce knowledge and the conditions of value and legitimacy that go along with those. But we talked about the academic world more broadly. So participants in the ethnography were very clear that measuring forums, such as the Research Excellence Framework, the internal assessments for the ref, promotion assessments, peer reviewing, module evaluation questionnaires, and the National Student Survey create environments of competition and oppression between colleagues and between the academic and their employing institution. Daily and mundane academic work practices then seem to be a driver of unkindness. Opportunities for measuring and evaluating can end up as a chance for rumor, gossip, and briefing against one's intellectual enemies, according to the academics that I did fieldwork with. One of my participants, Andy, expanded on this, telling me that academics are bastards and bitches when they know it's all done anonymously. They'll say things in a review that they would never say to your face, which they know will damage you. It's important, I think, to know Andy's insistence that this damage is deliberate and calculated. He recognized it as a party paradigmatic rivalry, saying that they come from a different paradigm and they're trying to knock a paradigm they don't like, and they pretend it's all done objectively and that there's no bias in it, but of course there is. It's apparent, I think, from Andy's narrative that elements of the neoliberal university converge with broader intellectual inequalities and power machinations to amplify attitudes and practices of unkindness. Added to this, it also does not help that, as Les Back says, in academia we are not valued for our generosity, but rather, and as he writes, the sharpness of our intellect, for the unflinching nature of our academic judgments. These adjectives, sharp, unflinching, all connote severity and anger, masculinized ideals of strength. No one, as Andrew Sayer writes, wants to be thought of as uncritical. To do so is effectively to admit that, as he says, you are naive and gullible. Criticality, Les Back says, becomes a badge of excellence. while generosity shows suspicious signs of intellectual feebleness. And there lies the problem, I think, with academic kindness and unkindness. The rewards for selfishness or damaging other people's opportunities are apparently legion, whereas kindness, care, generosity not only lack any form of reward or recognition as valuable, but are actually seen as negative markers against one's intellectual ability and your professionalism. Something not often, I think, talked about in the context of academic kindness is structural inequality. Often the focus instead is on day-to-day kind acts, little acts of kindness, and kind of the emotions and the individuals that go along with those. But we also, I think, need to consider how racism, sexism, colonialism, xenophobia, classism, transphobia, ableism all work to create structures, atmospheres, and cultures which lack care and humanity. For instance, in my own ethnography, participants would often tell me about the really commonplace ways that racism is done in sociology. They mentioned being on what Namal Pua calls the receiving end of the look of insidious reply all departmental emails that challenge them and their identifications of inequality, but don't actually include them in the email themselves, and of the exhaustion of having to restate and re-argue structural exclusions of people of colour from academia. And as Kate Stang's research shows, these exclusions don't vanish in other marginal communities. She writes about how ethnic minority women academics feel marginalised as women in the academy and further marginalised as Black academics within feminism. These structural inequalities are also felt intellectually via the hierarchies produced through metrics. And Ana Cristina Santos has written about there being a disciplinary hierarchy where some forms of knowledge are seen as more valuable and more authoritative and worthwhile than others. So all of this creates a situation where unkindness really becomes part of the rules of the game, to use a Bourdieusian metaphor, characterizing the mores and the expectations of the field and being slowly inculcated into the academic habitus. It is the water that we swim in. Neoliberalism encourages selfishness, individuality, and callousness, so that, drawing from my own personal reflections in my field notes, we hear utterances from colleagues such as, "It's every person for themselves." So, what's wrong with academic kindness? I am increasingly skeptical and scathing about the idea of academic kindness. What it often means is actions such as saying hello in the corridor, smiling, swapping jokes, chatting over the kettle, doing little favors for each other, things that might be thought of as the day-to-day minutiae of friendly personal interactions. And to say here, though I'm skeptical about the transformational properties of this kind of academic kindness, I don't think that these actions are necessarily insignificant or insincere. Fieldwork participants, friends, colleagues often tell me how much they value these fleeting corridor smiles or warm words as we run in the opposite direction. It matters, I think, to our general sense of well-being for someone to make casual conversation whilst brewing a cup of tea or to ask how you are in passing. These acts feel humanized and bring a touch of the personal and the intimate to a workplace guided by neoliberal principles of competition and ruthlessness. There are, though, two problems with relying on this as our academic kindness. One, during my ethnography, one of the most common narratives was the idea that academics are two-faced, duplicitous, that your seemingly friendly colleague is also undercutting you behind your back, spreading rumors about you, making your life deliberately more difficult. Two, and most importantly, I think we need to talk about killjoys. The result of these friendly engagements, I would argue, is a generalized atmosphere of geniality and friendliness and cheerfulness. The pains and the frustrations of the neoliberal community, of the neoliberal university rather, are briefly and superficially this veneer of harmony and happiness. And because we are oriented towards happiness, as Sarah Ahmed says, it becomes desirable to maintain these relations and conventions which uphold this happy state of being. To keep in place this, what I would call weak, but feel good kind of kindness. The rub is, I think, that in these conditions of such precarious happiness, speaking about the anxieties, shames, stresses, tensions, frustrations, and abuses of the academy becomes to a lot of people really distasteful and quite often even offensive. Instead, we're encouraged to stay happy, stay professional. I think instead, this is part of my loose manifesto for how we might do things otherwise, I think we should be academic killjoys, and here's why. A lot of it has to do with ideas of professionalism and what professionalism means. And I'm going to argue that professionalism is a trap. Professionalism is about behaving, moving, speaking, carrying yourself in such a way that you fit seamlessly and harmoniously within your workplace. It's a degree of comfort and security in occupying this space, which is what Bourdieu refers to as sens pratique, or a feel for the game. So through time and exposure, we develop this feel for the game so that it becomes instilled in our habitus. And through this technique, the rules of the field reproduce and relegitimize themselves. So I would argue that reproduced in this sens pratique or professionalism of academia are things like whiteness, patriarchy, middle classness, colonialism, heterosexism, and ableism. Likewise, it's the emotional disposition that go along with these social and political locations which occupy the ruling position and become understood as professional kinds of emotions: cosmopolitanism, restraint, moderation, resilience, grit, robustness, and quite often also compliance. To be other, emotionally speaking, is to be at odds with the norms and mores of academia, especially if you were also not able to fit with categories of whiteness, maleness, etc. There is no space, I think, in this sort of professionalism for care work, for selflessness, for community. And equally, within this sense of professionalism, radical and exuberant emotions look and feel. They're reminders of unrestrained figures such as the angry Black person or the hysterical woman. I think the weak form of academic kindness becomes tied to dominant notions of professionalism because it maintains this rule of happiness. It brings a passivity which enables this flow of inequalities to continue. And it's a disposition which I think favors the status quo in that it does very little to disrupt the status quo. Because of this, giving voice to abuses in academia, especially located in specific practicalities and localities of our everyday spaces, our colleagues, our managers, departments, subject associations, accepted working practices, is to make a fuss or be disruptive or cast yourself as a troublemaker. When your choices are shaped within this set of largely unspoken rules and conventions, what scope is there for voicing opposition to the neoliberal system with the inequalities of academia and the university? If your workplace is ostensibly a space of friendliness and cheerfulness, and you're being told to keep it that way, and the neoliberal university is telling you that everything is fine and you're lucky just to have a job at all, what possibility is there for disrupting this apparent peace with your identifications of being overworked and abused and being sad and fearful and unhappy? Instead of wholly adopting this weaker form of kindness, I would suggest that we look to Sarah Ahmed's killjoy, feminist killjoy. This figure, Sarah Ahmed says, spoils the happiness of others. She writes, she's a spoilsport because she refuses to convene, to assemble, or to meet up over happiness. I think we should make similar refusals in academic spaces, because a refusal for me to meet up over happiness is also a refusal to be complicit in these institutional and even personal violences. The key, I think, is this challenging to the unkindness and the inhumanity and the toxicity of academia broadly and our workplaces specifically. So, is there another academic kindness? This picture that's on the screens now is taken from some fieldwork that I did in Santiago in Chile earlier this year during their or in the wake rather of their kind of constitutional crisis, which in itself is a sort of refutation, rebelling against neoliberalism and the way it's constructed into the system and the way it's constructed into everyone else's lives. And the Spanish says otro fin del mundo es posible, which is another end of the world is possible. And I saw that and I thought it very much kind of chimed with the things that I was thinking about in terms of academia and how we do things in this sector. And so, okay, if this nice academic kindness isn't the answer, and I don't think it is, then what might be? So our challenge is, as Ros Gill says, to turn down the heat of this hyper-competitive academic kitchen. I want to argue for a radical form of kindness that is turned towards dismantling inequalities from the ground up. I'm not certain about what name it would be called, but I'm going to call it radical kindness for the purposes of this paper. Radical might not be the right word. So this kindness for me, it privileges generosity, support, and mutual care, and it acts ethically in harmony with core principles of care, respect, and humanity. It values and rewards collaboration and collegiality, and recognizes that even as individuals, we are part of and responsible to a wider connected community. Radical kindness for me would be underpinned by a collegiality that is vigilant about power and power relations, and one which refuses damaging and oppressive hierarchies, challenges to exclusionary positions and values, and one which acts ethically to counter or alleviate the harms and violences of dominant power, especially that dominant power which we wield ourselves. So this approach draws on anti-racist, capitalist, intersectional feminist principles in its foregrounding of these ideas of mutual cooperation, sharing of work, collectivism, and particularly owes a debt to Black feminists such as Bell Hooks, Angela Davis, Audre Lorde, Kimberly Crenshaw, most especially kind of coming from that very famous Audre Lorde statement that the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. Using the tools of neoliberalism and the tools of the powerful is not going to help us in challenging the space in our lives. So for me, radical kindness is about recognizing and acting on our shared humanity. And generosity, vulnerability, and cooperation for me are the key parts in doing this. So let me expand on what these would mean sort of in practice. Les Bach has been for me very important in thinking through the need for generosity in academia. He describes, and I quote, how valuing the work of others becomes a way to strike a small blow of munificence against the miserliness of academic life. And he says this is distinct from casual pleasantries. It is, to quote, not just a matter of being nice to others. And this is partly why I would reject that kind of what I think is a form of academic kindness. So rather, Les Bach elucidates that ways of generosity of thought and action prompt a kind of a splashback effect, bringing a sensation of care and respect, not only to the person on whom generosity is being visited, but also the person who's doing the generosity. Intellectual generosity, he says, is about the pleasure that can be taken in admiring the work of others that you feel animates something important. So this isn't a simple external facing actions, but it's a holistic engagement by which one's own temperament and bent towards the adversarial and competitive nature of the neoliberal academy is soothed through acts of generosity. This orientation towards a shared sense of humanity is also found in the importance of vulnerability to radical kindness. So audit culture is about being measured and assessed, and it follows, therefore, always presenting a very particular, very able, very polished version of ourselves. This attitude of not just coping, but excelling provides this veneer, this kind of protection for the neoliberal university, because they can say, look, you're fine. And that in itself enables further violence and further exploitation, because if you're fine, then they can give you more work to do. Dave Beer suggests that one method for countering this aspect of the neoliberal university in our workplace is co-creating an atmosphere of fearless disciplines. So instead of constantly churning out glossy publications, he says, and refined talks, Beer suggests that we focus on ideas and sharing. And sometimes he says this will be raw, but what's important is that, and I quote, the roughness around the edges gives others some purchase to respond and encourages them to enter into a dialogue about the limitations and the inadequacies of the proposal. So this is what I mean by vulnerability. The openness to giving analysis that is still a work in progress, showing you're working out, articulating your intellectual growth, owning the times that we've been wrong or under-researched. It is a refutation of perfection and perfectionism. We also, I think, need to be vulnerable in our everyday academic lives, especially some form of security or power or prestige. I've lost count of the number of times a fellow early career precarious friend has told me that their permanently employed colleagues will sympathize with their overwork, with their exploitative contracts, with their casualization over the coffee machine, but they stay silent in departmental meetings, or they actively refuse changes that would improve casualization in the department or in the university. I've also lost count of the number of times in my experience that the person speaking up against inequalities in departmental meetings or similar is also themselves most sharply subject to those inequalities. It shouldn't be left, I think, to academics of colour, to women, to disabled scholars, to precarious scholars, queer scholars, working class scholars, to bear the weight of speaking truth to power. We need to be brave and bold and public. Ros Gill has written about her experiences of doing this and how she feels like the party pooper whenever she speaks up. And I would invite us all, therefore, to be party poopers like Ros. It's important, I think, to extend this sense of cooperation and generosity into how we make our knowledge claims, how we claim expertise and authority. So I recall a conversation with one of my PhD supervisors not that long ago, feeling kind of not entirely certain about my place in academia or direction of my research. And I said to her, I just want to be able to stake out my territory. And gently, but forcefully, she responded that I was thinking wrong-headedly. She says, it's not about territory. You can't engage in that sort of competition. What's important is who you're in dialogue with. What conversations are you adding to and extending? This notion of cooperation, for me, cooperation through dialogue is the soul of radical kindness. It's the idea that intellectual endeavour is not an individual competitor sport, it's a team game. Radical kindness, I think, is the recognition that we discover and create together and subsequently acting on this. So to bring this to a conclusion, I'm going to pick a few holes and a few problems in this notion of radical kindness and in how we discuss kindness and care more broadly. Writing about kindness is extraordinarily complex and a frustrating task. And what do I mean by kindness? What do you mean by kindness? Writing about the distressing and problematic and disreputable aspects of your own workplace is challenging and it poses a risk for both author and for any potentially identifiable sources used in marshalling evidence of these kinds of difficulties. And this kind of task, especially when framed in terms of emotion, kindness, care, cruelty, is also an intellectual and methodological challenge. How do you build a case that an often positivist academia will take seriously when the harms done and experienced are done so in transitory, ineffable, and often offhand manners? It's difficult, as John Law notes, to successfully account for that which is fleeting and momentary. The experiences shared with me as a researcher are generally not those of overt bullying, physical violence, or obvious harassment. They're throwaway comments, sly looks, oppressive atmospheres. So how then might these sorts of harms and inequalities be successfully demonstrated and analysed such that they can be taken seriously in a space that demands evidence to be material and replicable and observable? These are questions of value and value systems which underpin both the university as an intellectual space and as a neoliberal workplace. There's always the risk in telling your story that all you do, or that of others, that all you do is put yourself and them at more risk. Especially from a space which neither shares your values nor recognises their validity in the hierarchy of power. Radical kindness is not a type of kindness that is especially showy or flamboyant. It's not being the office joker or the office parent or anything, but because it is a disposition deliberately set to frustrate the structures of power, it is a kindness which makes its actor hypervisible. What I shared isn't a perfect or complete response, I think, to the harms of the neoliberal academy or the place or role of kindness within academia, but I think the radical kindness, I think, might not necessarily be infallible. There is the problem, as Andy says, that some in academia, like everywhere, some are just bastards and bitches and no amount of generosity is going to change that. The photograph that is on the screens right now is again something from Chile, from Santiago. Destruye nuestro corazón la lógica del sistema, which means destroy in your heart the logic of the system. So this is, you know, what's internalized, what we think is normal, but isn't actually normal at all. And I think this is where radical kindness can help us, where it's especially apt in this moment, in sort of quietly but surely helping us to reshape our everyday spaces, acting with integrity, dignity, and care, so that these emotional bearings fill our spaces of work, connecting us and protecting us, and allowing us, supporting us, to destroy the logic of the neoliberal system in our own hearts. And I'm going to leave it there. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Sarah, for that fantastic talk. So wide-ranging and thought-provoking, and I just love this invitation to reframe ourselves as academics. You've generated a lot of questions already. So I think, well, not too many, don't worry. So I think I'll just go straight into invite people to verbally sort of ask. I think it's nice to create that sense of community rather than me having, you know, just like repeating all the questions on behalf of people. So Jennifer, your question was first. Would you like to come in and ask Sarah in person?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Hi, Jennifer.
Perfect. Hi, Sarah, thank you so much. That was a wonderful talk. I myself, I'm at the moment very frustrated with academic spaces. And I was wondering, as an early career researcher myself, I understand a lot of what you said, and I myself am trying a lot of what you said, but I don't know. I was wondering if you can see a possibility for ERCs who are so precarious and who kind of are expected to follow all those rules of the neoliberal university to figure out a strategy of resistance as ERCs.
If I knew that, I would be a lot happier in my own life. Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really difficult question. And one of the things I didn't quite kind of say explicitly in that talk, but maybe kind of a bit more implicitly, is that academic kindness is going to be different and resistance is going to be different depending on what your career position is. And depending on, as I say, like how much power you've got to kind of to speak up, how much security you've got to speak up. And I find that all the academic jobs that I've had since my Viva, I found that just by speaking up at all, any ECR, anyone kind of precariously employed is always already approached as being a bit of trouble, as they're opening their mouth, they're obviously going to say something about the terrible conditions of their employment and their kind of working practices and things like that. So I think it's very difficult for us to kind of mount any resistance at all. I'm not being very optimistic here. I don't really feel very optimistic. My strategy so far has been to surround myself with people who feel the same way as me. You need your crew. You need people that think the same way as you, that can, essentially the institution gaslights us, and we need people that understand that gaslighting to bring us back to normality and to remind us that that gaslighting is going on. That's not very helpful, I suppose, but yeah, sorry.
Thank you, Sarah. That's brilliant. Jennifer, I don't know if you wanted to come back at all.
Am I still there?
Yeah.
Okay. No, I completely agree. It's really, really hard, and I feel the same way you do. And yeah, we just have to keep trying, I think. Thank you.
It's very difficult. Yeah.
There is another question by Silke, and maybe Silke, this kind of will follow on nicely from the previous question, and maybe sort of give us ways of thinking about addressing the previous question as well, if you'd like to come in.
Thank you very much for this brilliant talk, Sarah. Very, very much appreciated. And yes, I think it follows on. So I was wondering to what extent you hear different things from different generations of women. And so I'm almost 60. I started studying in the 80s in Germany, where there were no female professors. Yeah, so I mean, it was really the dark ages. Then I moved to the States in the early 90s, and my supervisor then brought me in contact with sociologists for women in society, and I always perceived them as my fairy godmothers, who throughout my academic career looked after me. And so I feel that I received a lot of kindness. And when I compare the BSA meetings with the ASA meetings, there are so many more women and women of color and people of color in leadership positions. So there is kind of a transformation going on. And so my question is a little bit, to what extent would we be able to learn and draw from institutions that come from the second wave, even if, and I know all the problematics about the dominance of white middle-class women, and I don't want to minimize that, but on the other hand, I sometimes feel it's sometimes exaggerated, because some organizations are not as white as they are sometimes described. So I think one has to have a close look. But so to what extent the unions, organizations of women, of people of color and other groups can provide networks of support, which are on the one hand safe spaces, but on the other hand are also challenging practices. So that's what I want to throw out. Thank you.
I think that's an interesting question. as I was saying in the talk, I am kind of going to specifically Black feminism for a lot of sort of inspiration and theorizing and things like that in terms of creating ideas about resistance and things like that. And so it's really those sorts of like mobilizing groups. If you think about people like Audre Lorde and Angela Davis and those sorts of women, they weren't simply academics, they were also activists and sort of campaigners and things like that, and kind of making a real tangible change in their spaces, and kind of pointing out the ways in which that the academy needed to kind of to change its spaces as well. So I think there's a lot that we can learn from particular kind of forms of feminism, and certainly kind of second wave feminism is very, I think, kind of well known and kind of regarded for being good at mobilizing and things like that. Despite the issues, I think that a lot of us would have with certain elements of kind of second wave feminism now, there's a sense of sort of energy and innovation in those sorts of groups that I think is really useful and helpful to draw upon, and yeah, does provide us those kind of safe spaces. But I think currently, like you mentioned, unions, so I think one of the people that is doing really good work in kind of the kind of academic kindness that I would recognize as useful and supportive and kind of forward thinking is Jo Grady, our General Secretary for UCU, and the way that Jo goes about her academic life and her union life, and the fact that she kind of, that she's very much kind of in this like listening and speaking plainly and avowing the problems that are kind of going on. And there's none of the sort of the business speak at the Neoliberal University that kind of comes through with Jo. She's not a kind of a politician unionist. She's kind of working sort of from the ground up in that kind of way, and looking kind of to dismantle those sorts of power structures. So I would look to kind of people like Jo for some good inspiration.
Thank you, Sarah. We have some great questions, a lot of great questions. So I'm not sure we're going to be able to get through them all. So apologies to everybody if I'm unable to invite you to speak, because there are so many questions. Perhaps Sarah will be happy to speak at a later date, maybe via email to you or some other form. So maybe I'll take some of the broader questions, perhaps. So there are a few by some anonymous attendees. So I guess I will be just asking them myself. I don't know if that means that you're anonymous because you want to remain anonymous or not. Assuming that you do want to remain anonymous, I'll just ask it, which is, so I wanted to mention that the people who've chosen to attend are probably implementing the practices that you've suggested. So even to the point to one's own detriment. So how do we encourage others who aren't here and should be listening to this talk to do that?
Well, this is a conversation for everyone that Diana and I have been having ourselves. So when we kind of decided to do this and open it up to the public, we were kind of thinking, well, we should really do something in our own department, because the people that naturally come to talks like this are the people that sort of have located the neoliberal system in their own hearts anyway, and are working to sort of to recognize that and to sort of become uncomplicit with the system. And it's really people that wouldn't gravitate towards a talk like this that actually need to hear it. I think I find it difficult to sort of say how we would make those people do anything, because I find it hard to make anybody do anything in academia, because I'm so very junior and no one really, ever since I got a postdoc, people take me less seriously than when I was working as a teaching fellow. I've sort of gone back to this kind of almost student status, I think. So I find it quite difficult to make those sorts of decisions. But I think what would really help is like joined up thinking among sort of structures and hierarchies and kind of career gradations within the university. So I know I was quoting Rose Gill a lot in that talk. Rose Gill is one of my fellowship mentors. So there's kind of I don't know, lineage of this kind of rebellion going on, and I think if we can sort of, I think quite a lot of the time the agitating is coming from early career scholars, and if we can sort of find our ways into getting these sort of mentors like Rose, like Diana, that kind of can sort of take the concerns a little bit further, because sometimes these things have to come out of the mouth of more of a peer for people to take them seriously, I think. But speaking out in kind of every departmental meeting is probably useful, but as is sort of biding your time, because quite often you have to disguise yourself as sort of one of them in order that you can be taken seriously. Because as I say, if you're constantly mouthing off, let's say you become this kind of hysterical woman that can't be taken seriously because you're constantly angry, and that anger becomes used against you. And Audre Lorde writes a lot about using anger as a kind of a motivation, as sort of like a way of building something. And I think holding that for ourselves is a useful thing.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. I mean, I think you've actually also answered one of the other questions a little bit in that response. I'll just read it out so that people feel like, you know, we're covering things. And that was about the kind of extra risk of minority groups becoming even more academic prized by practicing radical kindness in this context. You've sort of addressed that a little bit in that answer there. So I had another question by Sarah. Sarah, would you like to come in and ask your question? This is about sort of giving concrete examples, but Sarah, you might want to give your own concrete example first.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes,
Yeah.
we can. Hi.
Hi, yeah. So I think it does relate a little bit to what people were saying in terms of, you know, a lot of people listening today will already be kind of thinking about these things and the challenge of kind of encouraging others. So yeah, and thinking about concrete ways to do that. So, you know, through kind of our processes and structures, I suppose, but then also worrying about whether, you know, that we're then becoming complicit. So I just had an example whereby in a previous department I was in, we were looking at various ways of improving relationships, and particularly improving, you know, the kind of career progression of people lower down the hierarchy. And I don't know if this is still in place, but at the time we introduced within the annual appraisal system a section of the form which hadn't previously been there, where people were asked to demonstrate what they had done and what they would do the following year to support and promote the career development of more junior colleagues. So, you know, I guess at the time I was thinking, well, that's a good idea. That should, you know, highlight the need to be supportive and so on, and not just look after yourself. But then I suppose now I'm thinking at the same time, is that actually is that complicit, because it is doing something within the pre-existing performance management structures, which, you know, are themselves perhaps you know, means of control and a means of directing our efforts to particular things that the university wants to demonstrate success on. So yeah, just kind of your thoughts on that, and whether there are other ways of, I suppose, perhaps dismantling and introducing different structures and processes rather than working within the existing ones.
Yeah, I think that's really important, because then these things become just part of the metrics, that it becomes a thing to measure rather than a thing to actually do. It's like teaching evaluations and the TEP and the National Student Survey and things like that, that we all want to be good teachers and we want to do the best for students and give them a good experience and give them good pedagogy, but the actual ways that things are measured kind of, they run counter to that, and so you end up working to fill in the form rather than working to actually do good teaching in that sense. So like concrete examples for how to do radical kindness outside of the structures that we already have. I think part of the reason that I feel like radical kindness is fallible is because it runs so counter to, it doesn't fit into any of the sort of structures or streams that we have for being valued within the university as it is. So there is not a lot of kind of immediate encouragement or incentivization to do any of this stuff, which is why I think a lot of people don't bother doing it, because we would all quite like to do these things, but when you're constantly kind of on the grill and, you know, filling in things so that your performance appraisal will be fine and you won't get, you know, harassed in the institution for that, then it can be very difficult to do anything else, anything outside of the logic of neoliberalism. I think one of the things that's most important is to create an atmosphere of collegiality and collaboration. And I think that means starting small. I mean, I know I was kind of being scathing about the other kind of weaker forms of kindness, but I think that there can be good starting points for forms of collaboration and collegiality. So making sure that you spend some form of social time with other people in your department, specifically when new members of the department start, making sure that you introduce yourselves to them, that you kind of take yourself off campus with them and have a coffee, that you show that you are to be trusted and on their side, and that you are an ally within that neoliberal space, I think is really important, because then when that person ends up, as they inevitably will, having their horror stories, they've got some, there's a sense that you kind of know who to go to, that you know how to link up with for that. And I've always really appreciated the people that have done that for me, and in certain situations I've wished that there had been someone that had done that. Because I think one of the things about oppression in the neoliberal academy is that it can be very lonely and very isolating and very alienating. And once you get down into it, you kind of feel like you're the only one, and that there is no kind of, there's no upward trajectory anymore. So I would suggest that kind of low level collaboration at first.
Thanks, Sarah. I mean, I think this, again, we've got another question which might sort of follow on very neatly from that, and it's about compassion. Jessica, I don't know if you want to come in and ask your question about compassion and how. Is Jessica here? Yes. And sorry, just to say before, we've got 3 questions altogether in about 7 minutes, so just maybe keep your answers slightly brief so we can cover everything. Thanks.
Hi, sorry, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Sorry, I've got some caring responsibilities today, so I've found compassion is a really useful concept. I've done some work kind of opposing compassion to well-being, which I think, you know, in a similar way to maybe the kind of weak forms of kindness, it's actually become quite kind of harmful rather than helpful. So I was just wondering if you've kind of thought about compassion at all, and how that might link in with notions of academic kindness.
I've been thinking a lot about the idea of love in the neoliberal academy and what that means, and kind of the all-embracingness of love, and the kind of the total acceptance that that is sort of conferred within love, and that idea that the lack of judgment in that sort of like very pure kind of human condition conception of love, that yeah, it hasn't gone very far. It sort of ended up in my head being sort of a little bit hippie-ish, I guess, if we could all just love each other a bit more. So one of the things that I find quite difficult is to sort of marry that love versus the workplace, and to what extent professionalism is a useful concept and not a sort of a tool of oppression. But yeah, like finding those two, finding the space between those, I think is really important. Yeah. Right.
I just had one comment from another anonymous attendee, which I'll just share, which is that, you know, that it's great to hear you, Sarah, talking about when you want to, having your crew, but then unfortunately actually left alone because the fear that people have of speaking up. So I thought that's quite an interesting point to bring in. But we've got 2 more questions, so perhaps we could go now to those, possibly 3 if I get to the last one. Joe, would Joe like to come in? It's a question about how radical kindness can avoid being enfolded into the neoliberal academy.
Coming. Hello.
Oh, hi.
Hello. Thank you so much, Sarah. There's, as you said before, lots of things that I guess everyone is already attuned to. But my concern is how radical kindness can avoid being measured and enfolded into the neoliberal academy agenda. And I'm thinking particularly of the way in which radical academics, mainly white, male, permanently contracted, cherry-picked and voiced, published about the UCU protests that a lot of precarious colleagues were involved with a couple of Februaries ago, replicating the issues that were being protested, but then gaining their publishing kudos and their kind of career trajectory off that. How do you protect your kindness? How do you establish those boundaries? And maybe I was thinking about that in relation to the killjoyness. Like how do those boundaries get negotiated? Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's a really important question, and not one that I have sufficiently considered, I have to say. What I wonder is whether, because I think that academic kindness has already been co-opted by the system. There are a lot of people who will now kind of brand themselves as feminists or anti-racist or that kind of thing to give themselves what they say as kind of kudos within the system. That sort of kudos of kindness, but it isn't kind of in any sense genuine, if you like. I wonder whether radical kindness would always sit outside of the neoliberal university, whether it would just be, it should never ever be part of it in the first place. And maybe that's something, maybe, I'm not sure if it's something that would change the system as opposed to change our relationship to the system.
Because the other thing I was thinking about, was the way in which using the power of precarity in as much as that these are the spaces where people such as myself, for example, I work teetering on the edge of academia, but I also work in other fields as well within my local community, and actually taking those and transforming those public knowledges might be the space that causes the pressure for changes, because out with there's a market that the university responds to. So it was just thinking about those kind of geographies of spaces beyond.
Yeah, and I think there's something to be said as well for me, all of this academic kindness and neoliberalism stuff is connected to the idea of the intellectual and expertise and sort of the notion that we have of ourselves as lone scholars and that kind of like mythical hero scholar. And yeah, the idea that if academia was kind of less inward looking, and I think kind of during the pandemic and not being so much in kind of in the office and like physically connected to people, I've got myself more of a perspective on what it means to be an academic and whether it's really as important as I thought it was. And I think if universities and the sector had more of a sense of that perspective, that would kind of help us, because a lot of the violences are committed in because we're told that kind of this is a vocation and wants to be here and leaving is a bad thing.
Yeah, okay, there are a couple of just comments really that I'll share again that kind of really bring to light the kind of experiences in the academy. So one person says, I know a senior academic woman who uses that kindness to earn the trust of junior academics and then proceeds to steal from their research or exploits their work. And then there is nothing they can do to prove or change what happened. Someone else says, to add on to Sarah's point, I really think supporting junior colleagues on a form in a concrete example is antithetical to kindness and the wider notion of academic community. I have noticed that there are more senior privileged male, pale male and stale, are very quick to call the department a community when it would be favourable for those who are marginalised in a multitude of ways to label themselves as such if they choose to do so. I do not fit into the typical academic, and I do get angered by that labelling of a we. So, Sarah, we had one more question, but we reached 2 o'clock now. Did you want to give a quick response to any of those 2 comments before we finally wrap up?
Yeah, I mean, I think the kind of the question of whether we're we or whether we're individuals is a really important one, because sometimes we can obscure what's happening under the guise of the sort of everything's okay kind of thing. So we need to think really carefully about what we mean when we say community. Yeah, that's definitely something to take away. That's really important.
Okay, fantastic. So we have, do you want to take one more question, Sarah? I don't know if you've got anything else to go on to. It's literally
after this, it's gross. Yeah, go on, another one.
Okay, one very last question. Obviously, if people have to leave, don't worry. But Bobby, would you like to come in with your last question? If you haven't had to go off and teach or something. Yeah, Bobby, do come in.
Thanks. It was a great talk, Sarah. Very quickly, just going. I think you may have partly addressed this. From what I understand, without sounding too cynical, resistance from academics is almost futile. So what you've described here is more a coping mechanism in the neoliberal academy. In some of the horror stories I've heard from the early career researchers, forget about radical kindness. They would be happy with even some conservative kindness, any forms of kindness. But my question is this, that when I look at my PhD students, I look at their faces and I just can't help just feel pity, that I don't envy the career you're going to have, starting in this thing now. But coming to more practical terms, given the fact that there's so many constraints amongst academics, if you were given the opportunity, God forbid, to have a fireside chat with 6 vice chancellors of this country, based on your findings, what would be your recommendations, apart from asking them to resign, of course, but what would you recommend? Because I know you said that this has to be outside the academy, but on a very purely instrumental way, what would you recommend to the vice chancellors?
Well, I think your notion that they should quit is a really good I was on my staff induction day in my current job, and our vice chancellor came in to give us a chat. And this was a kind of a staff induction day for all sorts of staff, not just academics. So there were like the porters and the cleaners and admin people and things like that. And the VC or president, he likes to be a president, proceeded to kind of tell us how great it was that we were building all these really big, expensive teaching rooms with fantastic views across the city, and the students feel this and that and the other. And I'm like, but we've just had a staff survey that says that everybody is miserable and people feel bullied and people feel huge pressure in their jobs and they're exhausted and they're stressed and they're really unhappy. And maybe you could think about what it means for staff to work here, not just what it means for students to study here. So I think one of the things that I would recommend that vice chancellors do is to think about how staff relate to this idea of the student experience, because that's what's really been kind of co-opted and businessified, and that's kind of why our lives are the way that they are. So a little bit more joined up thinking between students and staff, and how we kind of all form this sort of community together, I think would be really welcome, instead of this kind of veneer of the student experience that kind of covers everything and allows a multitude of sins.
Thanks.
That helped.
Thank you, Sarah. So we have overrun by a few minutes, so I'm going to wrap up pretty quickly, and just to say thank you for such a stimulating talk. It's obvious that everyone has been completely fascinated by what you've had to say, and obviously we need some more time to talk about this. So thank you so much for inviting us to share, to share and listen to your talk, and hopefully we can have some more conversations. Please do keep an eye out for Sarah's work on this. I'm sure at some point you will be publishing on it, and do follow her on Twitter and keep up with her great work. Thank you, everybody. It's been a pleasure, and hope to keep in touch. Okay, bye-bye.